I'm recording this video in response to the question regarding attributing factors to the achievement gap between groups. The authors of Discrit first defined systematic inequalities as social constructions of race and ability that have great consequences in everyday interactions. That is to say that these preconceptions and attitudes towards minority cultures are often unnoticed or involuntary. They are underlying features of our current white culture. The systematic inequalities are infused in our culture's practices, perceptions, and even language. Throughout this chapter, the authors use their studies in inequalities surrounding individuals of non-dominant social groups to draw parallels to the experiences of people with disabilities. Two hugely important themes present in this section that really illustrate the origin of the achievement and opportunity gap between people who are Black, Latinx, and students with disabilities are the concepts of artifacts and cultural mediation. Both of these ideas illustrate the importance of history and culture. That is, perceptions and practices towards race and ability are inseparably tied to our history and culture. First, artifacts are anything that has been previously created by humans, such as language, cultural contexts, expectations, and tools. The other half is the concept of mediation, which refers to personal and social histories and human-made ideologies. I take artifacts to refer to more tangible and measurable cultural expressions, while mediation is a more underlying pervasive manifestation of racial perception. It's important to point out that this concept of mediation constitutes a lack of objectivity in all human observers who were brought up in such a cultural system. A great way the authors of this book articulate this idea is when they say, history lives in the present as our social inheritance. Along these lines, we live in a country that, within the last century, subscribed to and implemented eugenics-based principles in the educational evaluation and placement of students along racial lines. I would call this an artifact imprinted on our culture that still underlies certain perceptions of people living in this country, whether they realize it or not. When describing the achievement gap, the text offers a redescription of the concept by Ladson Billings, who refers to it as the educational debt. The term achievement gap seems to describe a student's inability to succeed based on his or her race, almost blaming the individual and the culture for which they came. The term educational debt draws into stark relief the tangible nature of educational inequalities financially and beyond, as I described in my last video evaluating the concept of goodness, and how perceptions of race create quantifiably diminished outcomes in those of non-dominant races because of the current educational climate. A great example was presented in the text of outlining factors contributing to the achievement gap. The El Pueblo Mágico study revealed the normalization of white middle-class culture fostered by educational systems where students of color become other or marginalized. According to the study, a contributing factor to this othering of students of color is that the system allows white people to maintain their individuality, not simply lumping them into a marginalized culture designation that becomes their sole identity. In reading this section, it is clear that as an educator, I must engage in reflective practices surrounding the artifacts and the dominant cultural ideologies that they nurture.